They say that death is the ultimate mercy, the final exit ramp off the highway of suffering that every man, sinner, or saint eventually prays for. In the concrete jungle of Harlem, where a bullet cost less than a loaf of bread and life expectancy was often measured in luck rather than years, death was usually a transaction, quick, violent, and final. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not a man who dealt in the usual currency of the underworld. He was not a brute who merely subtracted lives from the ledger of the city. He was a grandmaster, playing a game of four-dimensional chess while his enemies were still learning how to hold the checkers. And when the devil came to his doorstep to steal the future, Bumpy Johnson did not seek an eye for an eye. He sought a much darker, much more profound arithmetic. The story I am about to tell you is not found in the police reports of the NYPD, nor is it whispered in the confessional booths of St. Aloysius. It is a story that exists in the terrified silence between heartbeats, a legend of the most brutal sentence ever handed down by the informal mayor of Harlem. This is the story of the 43 years Vincent Esposito spent in a coffin made of his own flesh. It began on a Tuesday, September 12th, 1938. The air in Harlem was thick with the humidity of a late summer that refused to break, carrying the scent of roasted peanuts, exhaust fumes, and the electric charge of a city that never slept. At 11:47 p.m., inside the velvet-draped sanctuary of the Lenox Lounge, the atmosphere was one of sophisticated cool. The jazz quartet in the corner was playing a slow, mournful rendition of Body and Soul, the saxophone weeping low and heavy. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual corner table, a vantage point that offered him a clear view of the door and the street beyond. He was immaculate, as always, his suit pressed to razor sharpness, his demeanor that of a tenured professor rather than a crime lord. Beside him sat Mame, his queen, glowing with the radiance of expectant motherhood. They were celebrating, quietly, the promise of a new life. A child that would carry the Johnson bloodline into a future Bumpy was tirelessly paving with gold and blood. Enter Vincent Esposito. Vincent was a soldier for the Genovese crime family, a man whose ambition far outstripped his intellect. He was a button man who thought respect was something you could demand with a loud voice and a heavy pistol. That night, Vincent was drunk. Sloppy, arrogant drunk. High on the false courage of cheap whiskey and the misplaced belief that his Italian connections made him untouchable, even north of 110th Street. He stumbled past Bumpy's table, his eyes glazed, his balance failing. As he lurched toward the bar, his heavy frame collided violently with Mame's chair. It happened in a blur that seemed to last a century. The chair tipped. Mame, heavy with child, could not catch herself. She fell hard against the brass railing of the bar, her abdomen striking the metal with a sickening, dull thud that silenced the saxophone instantly. The room froze. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the Lenox Lounge. Every patron, every waiter, every musician knew who sat at that table. They knew that bumping into Bumpy Johnson was a mistake, but hurting his wife was a death warrant signed in triplicate. Vincent, too inebriated to comprehend the gravity of his error, merely sneered, dusting off his jacket and muttering a racial slur that hung in the silent air like a foul vapor. He didn't apologize. He didn't meal. He turned his back and ordered a drink. Bumpy did not move. He did not flip the table. He did not draw the pearl-handled piece he carried. He simply knelt beside Mame, his eyes scanning her face with a tenderness that terrified those watching because it was so completely at odds with the glacial coldness radiating from this posture. He scooped her up, his movements gentle, and carried her out of the club. As he passed Vincent Esposito, Bumpy paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't look at the Italian. He looked through him, staring at a point in the future that only he could see. Then he was gone. The tragedy unfolded in the sterile, white-tiled purgatory of Harlem Hospital. 3 hours later, a doctor with trembling hands emerged to deliver the news that breaks the soul of a father. The child was gone. The trauma of the fall had detached the placenta. The life that Bumpy and Mame had dreamed of was extinguished before it ever saw the sun. Inside the private room, the silence was louder than a cannon blast. Mame lay pale and shattered against the pillows, her grief a physical weight pressing down on the room. Bumpy stood by the window, staring out at the Harlem skyline, his face a mask of stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "I will bring you his head, Mame. By sunrise. I will bring it to you." It was then that Mame Johnson, a woman of grace and steel, whispered the words that would seal Vincent Esposito's fate. She reached out, gripping Bumpy's hand with a strength born of pure agony. "No, Bumpy," she choked out, tears cutting tracks through the powder on her cheeks. "Death is too fast. He took a lifetime from us. He took all the years our child would have had. Don't let him off with a bullet. Don't let him die. Make him understand the weight of time." Bumpy looked at his wife, processing the request with the terrifying logic of the grand strategist he was. A bullet was mercy. A bullet was an end to suffering. To kill Vincent was to treat him like a soldier. To keep him alive was to treat him like a specimen. Bumpy nodded once, a microscopic dip of the chin. "He will not die," Bumpy promised. "He will live. He will live longer than any of us." 2 days later, Vincent Esposito was found. He hadn't gone into hiding. His arrogance was so profound he believed the mob commission would protect him from a colored gamble. He was holed up in a safe house in East Harlem, playing cards with 2 other low-level associates. The door didn't get kicked in. There was no Tommy gun spray shattering the windows. Bumpy Johnson walked in alone. He walked in with the casual confidence of a landlord coming to collect overdue rent. The guards at the door were already unconscious, dispatched with the silent efficiency of Bumpy's lieutenants. But the room itself was Bumpy's stage. Vincent stood up, reaching for his waistband, but the look in Bumpy's eyes froze his hand. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the hot fire of vengeance. It was the clinical, detached curiosity of a mortician measuring a corpse. "You want to kill me, Johnson?" Vincent spat, trying to summon bravado. "You kill a made man? You start a war." "A war implies 2 sides fighting," Bumpy said, his voice smooth, cultured, terrifyingly calm. "This isn't a war, Vincent. This is an education." Bumpy moved. It was a blur of motion, efficient and economical. He deflected Vincent's clumsy punch and spun the man around. This was not a street brawl. Bumpy had studied anatomy. He had read medical texts with the same voracious appetite he applied to philosophy and history. He knew exactly where the wiring of the human machine was most vulnerable. With one hand clamping Vincent's shoulder to hold him upright, Bumpy drove the knuckle of his middle finger into the base of Vincent's neck, right between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. It was a strike of surgical precision, delivered with the force of a hydraulic press. There was a sound, a dry, sharp crack, like a dead branch snapping in winter. Vincent didn't scream. He simply dropped. He collapsed, not like a man knocked out, but like a marionette whose strings had been severed by a razor. He hit the floor in a heap, his eyes wide open, his mouth moving, but his limbs draped in unnatural, fluid angles. He tried to push himself up. Nothing happened. He tried to kick. Nothing. The signal from his brain screamed, "Move," but the body remained silent. He was severed. Bumpy stood over him, adjusting his cufflinks, looking down at the heap of flesh that was once a tough guy. "You took a life that hadn't started," Bumpy whispered, leaning down so his voice filled Vincent's ear. "So I'm giving you a life that will never end. You want to die, Vincent? That's too bad. Death is a gift, and I don't give gifts to men who kill my children." Thus began the sentence. The coffin of flesh. Vincent was rushed to the hospital by his own people, but the damage was irreversible. Quadriplegia, complete paralysis from the neck down. He could blink, he could chew if food was placed in his mouth, and he could speak in a raspy whisper, but he could not lift a finger to wipe a tear from his own eye. The mob, initially furious, prepared for retaliation, but then a message arrived at the Genovese headquarters. It was a ledger. It showed that Bumpy Johnson had set up an irrevocable trust in Vincent Esposito's name. The trust would pay for the absolute best medical care. Private nurses, specialized air mattresses to prevent bed sores, the finest antibiotics to treat pneumonia. Bumpy Johnson was paying to keep Vincent Esposito alive. The mob bosses, pragmatic businessmen themselves, paused. They realized the depth of the cruelty. To kill Bumpy would be to sign Vincent's death warrant, for the money would stop. And in a twisted way, they respected the sheer, biblical magnitude of the vengeance. They stepped back. Vincent was left to his fate. The first year was the year of rage. Vincent lay in a private room in a sanitarium upstate, screaming until his voice gave out. He cursed Bumpy Johnson. He cursed God. He cursed the nurse who wiped his chin. He begged his visitors to smother him with a pillow. "Do it," he would hiss at his brother. "Be a man and end this." But they couldn't. The fear of Bumpy Johnson cast a long shadow, and the doctors were paid handsomely to ensure the patient's heart kept beating. Vincent learned the torture of an itch on the nose that cannot be scratched. He learned the humiliation of having his bowels moved by a stranger's hands. He learned that time is not a constant. It stretches and warps when you are staring at a crack in the plaster ceiling for 14 hours a day. By the 5th year, the visitors stopped coming. A paralyzed man is a burden, a reminder of weakness. His wife divorced him. His children grew up and moved away, unable to bear the sight of the father who was a living corpse. Vincent was left alone with his nurses and his thoughts. This was the true prison. Bumpy knew that isolation was the acid that dissolves the mind. Vincent had to think. He had to think about that night in the Lenox Lounge. He had to replay that second of arrogance over and over again, millions of times. 1,825 days, 43,800 hours. Every single one of them bought and paid for by the man he had wronged. In 1948, 10 years into the sentence, Bumpy Johnson was at the height of his power. He walked the streets of Harlem like a king, handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving, paying rent for widows, and checkmating the Italian families at every turn. He never visited Vincent. He didn't need to. He received the monthly invoices from the sanitarium. He signed the checks with a flourish. That signature was his visitation. One evening, an associate asked Bumpy, "Why keep paying, boss? The guy is a vegetable. Let him go." Bumpy turned his cold, heavy-lidded gaze on the man. "He isn't a vegetable. A vegetable doesn't remember. He remembers. Every time he sees the sun rise, he knows he has to get through another day of doing absolutely nothing. That is his job now. His job is to wait." The decades rolled on. The world outside the sanitarium window exploded with change. The Korean War came and went. The civil rights movement set the streets of America on fire. Malcolm X preached on the corners of Harlem, and Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of the mountaintop. Vincent Esposito missed it all. He was frozen in 1938. His world was the rectangle of white ceiling, the rhythmic beep of monitors, and the taste of pureed food. He became a medical marvel, a man who refused to die because his enemy refused to let him. There were moments, the nurses said later, when Vincent would weep silently for hours. Not from physical pain, the paralysis took care of that, but from the sheer, crushing weight of existence. He had 15,695 days to regret 1 second. He became a philosopher of suffering. He analyzed his own regret like a scientist studying a virus. He realized that Bumpy hadn't just broken his neck. Bumpy had suspended him in amber. Then came 1968. The news flashed across the small black and white television positioned in the corner of Vincent's room. Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, had died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant. The king was dead. Vincent watched the footage of the funeral, the thousands of people lining the streets, the weeping crowds. A strange emotion gripped the paralyzed man. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief, it was panic. His jailer was gone. The man who held the key to his cage had departed the earth. Vincent realized with a jolt of terror that he was now alone in his suffering. The check might stop coming, or worse, the checks had been endowed to continue forever. And they did. Bumpy, the grand strategist, had foreseen his own mortality. The trust fund was self-sustaining. Even from the grave, Bumpy Johnson continued to force life into Vincent Esposito's lungs. The sentence was not life. The sentence was, until I say so. And Bumpy had never said stop. The 70s passed in a haze of disco and decay. Vincent's hair turned snow white. His skin became paper-thin, translucent, tearing at the slightest touch. He was a skeleton wrapped in parchment, eyes burning with a dim, ancient madness. He had outlived the doctors who first treated him. He had outlived the gangsters who abandoned him. He was a relic of a bygone era, a living fossil of the Harlem Wars. Finally, in 1981, 43 years after that night in the Lenox Lounge, the machinery of Vincent's body finally began to fail. It wasn't a sudden stop, it was a slow, grinding halt. His kidneys gave out. His lungs, tired of drawing breath for a body that served no purpose, began to fill with fluid. The young doctor on duty, a man born 20 years after Vincent was paralyzed, looked at the chart and shook his head. "It's time," he told the nurse. "Let him go." As they reached to turn off the ventilator, to disconnect the feeding tubes that had been his umbilical cord to hell, Vincent Esposito's eyes opened one last time. They were cloudy, rimmed with the yellow of jaundice, but for the first time in 4 decades, they were clear of fear. He looked at the ceiling, the white expanse that had been his sky, his cinema, his canvas. A single tear pooled in the corner of his eye and slid down into his silver hairline. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of gratitude. The debt was paid. The long shift was over. Bumpy Johnson, the ghost who had sat in the corner of the room for 43 years, had finally nodded his head. "You can go now." Vincent Esposito died at 3 a.m., alone, the last casualty of a war that ended before most of the hospital staff were born. This story, my friends, is why the legend of Bumpy Johnson endures. It is not because he could shoot straight. Any fool with a gun can pull a trigger. It is because he understood the terrifying power of mercy withheld. He understood that to kill a man is to end his story, but to keep him alive in agony is to rewrite his story every single day. Bumpy Johnson didn't just rule Harlem. He ruled the very concept of justice within his domain. He was a man who played the long game, a game where pawns were not merely sacrificed, but frozen in place, forced to watch the board for eternity. So the next time you hear someone glorify the quick draw or the drive-by shooting, remember Vincent Esposito. Remember the man who spent 43 years in a coffin of flesh because he dared to cross the Godfather of Harlem. Remember that in Bumpy Johnson's world, death was easy. Life was the hard part. And now I ask you, as you sit in the comfort of your freedom, able to move your hands, able to walk out that door, if you had to choose between the bullet and the bed, between the sudden dark and the 40-year stare, which mercy would you beg for? Think carefully. Bumpy is watching.